From Quinton Rampage Jackson's recent revelation of fixed matches in MMA to the UFC's long-discussed controversial fights in the past, I'm diving into the realm of UFC fight fixing. Well, in a shocking interview, Quinton Rampage Jackson said that MMA fights are being staged for money. And even though it's common knowledge that MMA and boxing aren't scripted like pro wrestling, Quinton says it's not unusual for fighters in either sport to take dives for money. The former UFC light heavyweight champion, in a conversation with Chris Van Vliet, said that he knows of many fake fights in MMA. What's more, he said that if he was to fight the interviewer could ask him to take a dive at him and that he'd pay him $10 million for it. Shockingly, he said that he'd do it. But according to him, there are intricacies. Like, of course, Quinton Jackson cares about how he's perceived by an audience. So the interviewer would have to hit the fighter super hard, and being the professional UFC fighter he is, that's just super usual for him. And it's even more simple when it's all planned out. After making such a huge statement, Quinton Jackson did take a rather neutral route. Rampage Jackson then said that he hasn't seen any UFC fighters taking dives for money himself.
Nice leg, caught the leg that time. Vanderlei came in quickly.
But then again, he did say that he's seen it happen in other organizations like Pride. In fact, he emphasized the fact that Pride wrestlers were all professional wrestlers, unlike WWE. This statement has caused a lot of stir in the UFC fan base. Many fans have reacted to it differently. Some even used his statements to accuse him of fixing his fight. So he got a lot of criticism for his fight with Fedor Emelianenko after his statement.
Tyson style. Yep. Was a clean speed away from people. And still.
Now, Fedor Emelianenko is a heavyweight legend in January 2023. Fedor won the fight with Rampage Jackson by TKO in 2:44 of the first round.
Using Rampage about where he's going to attack. Big shot. And it is all over. Big shot. Fedor Emelianenko.
Mind you, this was the first time Jackson had lost by TKO since 2005. So obviously, some fans thought that the fight was fixed after Rampage lost. On his Instagram, Rampage shot down those claims. He said that he'd never in his life do a fixed fight, but that wasn't enough for the high-spirited fan base. So he further went on to apologize to his fan base for his loss to Fedor. He said that he knew during the intense fight that one of them was going to get knocked out, but he hadn't really anticipated that it was him that was going to get the knockout. And then he went on to say that he gets paid for it. That's his job. Although he did voice his frustration over the loss, he rather emphasized the fact that the nature of the game is unpredictable, and it has caught him off guard many times. But then again, he showed a rather more optimistic approach towards his future. In the same interview, Rampage Jackson said that he wants another bout in the octagon after the loss. He said that he was quite unhappy with his last bout and how people perceived him afterwards, and it'd be unfortunate for him if he were to retire from UFC after the fight that made his fans question his integrity. He said that he's in talks with Shannon Briggs about his future bout. What's more, he seems quite hopeful about his next fight. In fact, he said that he'd be able to retire from UFC better if he's able to secure that win, though he did mention his interest in boxing. He said that perhaps he's too old for MMA at 44. It's understandable for a 44-year-old MMA fighter to take interest in boxing, since boxing doesn't take a toll on your knees as compared to UFC. But that's all about Rampage Jackson's future endeavors, and some fans are still hooked onto the idea of him being a cheater. In fact, his blunt recognition of the fact that fixes happen in UFC has caused a wave of scrutiny in the world of UFC. Many fans are now reconsidering how they felt about questionable UFC bouts that have happened in the past. In a tweet, one fan brought up the infamous Don Fry versus Mark Hall bout that happened way back in 1996. The two heavyweight fighters went head-to-head in what was supposed to be one of the most exciting fights of the year, and boy did they deliver. The fight was an all-out war that went back and forth between the two fighters, with both of them landing some devastating blows. But here's the thing. thing. Many people believe that the fight was rigged. That's right, rigged. According to some fans and experts, the fight was too perfect, with both fighters evenly matched and the fight going the distance. It was almost as if they had rehearsed the entire thing beforehand. So why would anyone rig a fight? Well, that's simple. Money. Boxing and MMA have a long history of shady dealings, with promoters and organizers willing to do anything to make a buck. And if you consider what Rampage Jackson has to say about it, well, it just all adds up.
Vanderlei appears very cautious, Mike. He's really feeling it out.
Besides, what better way to make money than to stage a fight that people will pay to see? But don't just take my word for it. Take a look at the footage yourself and decide whether or not this fight was too good to be true. And that's the case with many other bouts that have happened in the past, like the iconic Rich Franklin versus Ken Shamrock fight. And to this day, fans consider it a fixed match. This fight took place in 2007, and it was billed as a clash between two of the sport's biggest stars. Franklin was the UFC middleweight champion, while Shamrock was a legendary fighter who'd been in the game for over a decade. But once again, many people believe that this fight was rigged. In fact, some fans even went so far as to accuse the UFC of fixing the fight in favor of Franklin. So what's the evidence? Well, for starters, Shamrock was 43 years old at the time of the fight, and he hadn't won a fight in over 4 years. Meanwhile, Franklin was in his prime and had just come off a string of impressive victories. But the most suspicious thing about the fight was the way it ended. Franklin landed a knee to Shamrock's head, and the fight was stopped immediately. But many fans believe that the knee didn't even connect and that Shamrock was faking the injury in order to give Franklin an easy win. Once again, we have to ask ourselves, why would anyone rig a fight? Well, the answer again is simple: money. The UFC stands to make a lot more money if their champions keep winning. And if they control the outcome of fights, they can ensure that their champions stay on top. Speaking of which, I have to mention the Conor McGregor versus Eddie Alvarez bout. This fight took place in 2016, and it was one of the most highly anticipated fights of the year. McGregor was already a superstar, and Alvarez was the reigning lightweight champion. But once again, many fans and experts believe that this fight was rigged. The evidence? Well, for starters, McGregor was an underdog heading into the fight, despite his impressive record. Meanwhile, Alvarez was a seasoned veteran who had beaten some of the sport's biggest names, but the fight ended in a way that left many fans scratching their heads. McGregor knocked Alvarez down several times in the first round and finished him off in the second round, winning the fight by TKO. But some fans believe that the fight was rigged in McGregor's favor. They point to the fact that Alvarez seemed unusually passive and didn't put up much of a fight. They also note that McGregor seemed unusually confident and relaxed, almost as if he knew he was going to win. Well, there you have it on how the UFC is perceived after Quinton Jackson's shocking interview.